I'd like to talk about China a little bit because you've talked there about the kind of formidable position that the United States is in just geographically in terms of not having any real threats to the homeland. We haven't been invaded. We have, as you say, a giant fish-filled, watery barrier between us and the rest of the world and the places where a lot of the conflicts in the world come on. And yet you hear very much in the rhetoric of United States politicians, both Democratic and Republican, about the China threat that we face in our time, the massive existential threat to our way of life and the future of our country. Donald Trump previously, I mean, he kind of vacillates a lot. There's a lot of inconsistency, but he's declared before China is our enemy. He essentially used the term enemy to describe China. And the rhetoric from a lot of Democrats has not been much better when they talk about China. You are an expert on China. One of the things that you've argued a lot is that there's a lot of misperception about the nature of the Chinese government, the nature of the supposed threat. Where do you start to unpick and unravel the misperceptions about the supposed looming Chinese threat to the United States?
Well, China does pose a threat in the sense of that it threatens American primacy, both in Pacific Asia and ultimately on the global level, primarily because it is recovering its wealth and power. After a bad couple of centuries, it's back. For most of human history, China was about 1/3 to 2/5 of the global economy. It's reattaining that position. It was also an extraordinarily innovative country. It gave us some things you may regret, like paper and bureaucracy, the gunpowder and other things. Historically, and that it is, again, the most innovative society now on the planet. In 2030, according to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, 37% of the world's scientists, technicians, engineers, and mathematicians, or STEM workers, will be Chinese. So certainly in economic and technological terms, China is a threat to the position the United States has had at the head of the world since about 1870. It is, in fact, going back to where it was when we became independent. As late as 1820, China was over 1/3 of the world economy, and certainly a very powerful country. But because our foreign policy is now not focused on diplomacy, but on military matters, we posit a military threat. But let's examine that. First, China's geopolitical position is not anything like ours. It is surrounded by 14 neighbors, many of which have previously invaded it. For the previous 1,000 years, 600 of those 1,000 years, China was actually ruled by foreigners. The United States, Britain, France, and others participated, especially the Russians, participated in dismembering China in the 19th century. The Japanese joined that in the 20th century. The Chinese state, I don't know whether this is correct or not, but 35 million Chinese died at the hands of the Japanese between 1931 and 1945 when they rampaged through China. China has always been on the defensive. There are very few instances in history of China invading a neighbor. Vietnam would dispute that, of course, and so would Korea. But those countries have retained their independence for millennia. So we look at the current situation. There are no Chinese fleets off the American shores. There are no Chinese aircraft patrolling our coasts or anywhere else. We have a naval presence, an Air Force presence that conducts 3 to 4 hostile surveillance missions along the Chinese coast every single day, 3 to 4 every day. So we're in their face. They're not in our face. This is all about two things. First, the psychological problem of no longer being number one. It is difficult to adjust to a status that is less than number one if you've had it for 120, some 150 years. And in that regard, I would say that on the economic level, the correct comparison between economies is not to use the nominal currency value, exchange value, but rather purchasing power parity. And on that measure, the Chinese economy is already 1/3 larger than the United States economy. China produces 1/3 of the world's manufacturers. We produce 15%. And in 2030, we will have 4.2% of the world's STEM workers, while China has 37%. So this is pretty formidable. And but it's not military. And we run the risk that in going abroad in search of monsters to destroy, they will follow us home. We are poking the Chinese militarily in such a way that they may very well turn up in our hemisphere, on our borders, which they have not done so far.
At which point we will conclude that we were right to see them as a threat.
Of course. That is, we seldom make mistakes. That is something that we and the Chinese have in common, by the way. Neither of us ever admit that we were wrong about anything at all.
But there's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in some of these things where the United States takes actions that create a backlash and then uses the backlash as proof of the existence of the monster that we said was threatening us.
Self-fulfilling paranoia, yes.
Yeah. You gave a talk recently at Brown University. You had a few points that you said are you listed some of the distorted perceptions and unsubstantiated statements that are made commonly in U.S. Political discourse about China. I just want to go mention a couple of them. You touched on there. As opposing China's desire to emulate the USSR and impose its rule on its neighbors or oppose its ideology on the world, charges that it's China rather than the United States that rejects international institutions and rules, or it's China that takes a scofflaw position on international law and genocide, extrapolating from the Taiwan situation a threat to other countries' sovereignty and territory, which is you think is not the correct conclusion to draw, and dismissing China's claims in the South China Sea while championing those of other countries with equally dubious claims. So it seems like in all of those, there's exaggerated threat, there's kind of hypocrisy of not seeing that we're complicit in a lot of the things that we accuse China of doing, and there's just a lack of understanding of how China sees the world.
Well said, if I do say so myself. A lot of this comes from the fact that we engage in a priori reasoning, that is evidence-free reasoning. For example, the average American political figure seems to imagine that if you've seen one communist, you've seen them all. But in fact, the average American political figure has never met a communist, except perhaps a Vietnamese communist. And since they're anti-Chinese, they're not really communists, I guess. Anyway, there's a huge amount of hypocrisy, self-deception, a strange mixture of hubris, self-doubt, self-assurance, braggadocio. It's a rather strange combination. China is, of course, the perfect bête noire for the United States because it's beating us at our own game of capitalism. What could be worse than that?
We've been talking, the kind of terms that we've been using have been, the United States does this, the United States does that. But of course, there's been a transition between presidential administrations recently. That we had Trump's first term, we had a Biden term, now Trump is back. To what extent do you see differences versus continuity in the approach to China between Biden and Trump?
Well, there's quite a bit of continuity because essentially there is as you indicated earlier, something approaching a consensus in our Tweedledee, Tweedledum party system on this issue. And so there wouldn't necessarily be much difference. What is different, going now to current events, is that Mr. Trump, who is capable shown he's capable of colossal errors of judgment, also seems to be capable of colossal reversals of those errors. So what we have at the moment is a détente, if you will, a rollback of confrontation and tensions between the United States and China. The United States declared economic war on China. China didn't do that to the United States. China reciprocated. The United States has now rolled back some of the economic warfare, not all. The Chinese have responded by rolling back their response. This isn't a truce because it has a 90-day duration attached to it. It's not a ceasefire because we're going to keep shooting at each other rhetorically, at least, and with tariffs. It's simply a pause that refreshes in a long-term confrontation that the United States has chosen. Why did we choose this? I think part of it is explained by enemy deprivation syndrome. When the Soviet Union irresponsibly collapsed, as Kennan had predicted, we were left without an enemy to fight. And we turned to China immediately, almost. That became the pacing threat, to use the Pentagon's term at the time. And the Chinese were saved only by the emergence of Al-Qaeda as a more preferable enemy. But Al-Qaeda is now, the United States is waging counter-terrorist wars in 42 countries at present, and Al-Qaeda is not the fearsome thing in our minds that we once thought it was. I think that's probably mistaken, by the way, because we've made an awful lot of people in the Middle East sufficiently resentful and vengeful to imagine that they will do again what Al-Qaeda did. If you bomb someone and they don't have an air force, they figure out another way to bomb you. And that's what Al-Qaeda did.
Yes, our support for the destruction of Gaza might give us a new enemy soon enough. One final thing on China is a lot of people might point to, and I think do point to, Taiwan as the kind of example of the threat that China poses. And this is the narrative around Taiwan is very similar to actually the narrative around Ukraine, where the United States' job is to defend the rules-based order against aggression, to defend democracy against autocracy, and there is a threat coming from a larger, stronger neighbor that wishes to impose itself. Now, you have argued before that this is, a wild misunderstanding / oversimplification of the Taiwan situation, that it's important to get clear if we are to avoid this spiraling into some kind of armed conflict.
Well, we have tried to impose a sort of Taiwan analogous narrative on Ukraine, but I'll leave that for later.
We'll get to that one.
We're claiming it's a civil war within the former Russian Empire, basically. In the case of Taiwan, the Taiwan issue arose because the losing side in the Chinese Civil War was escorted by the United States to the island of Taiwan and protected there. This is a civil war which has not ended because the United States intervened in it. We intervened actually right after the Korean War broke out to confine the war to Korea by preventing Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists who had ensconced themselves on the island of Taiwan, the Taiwan province of China, from counterattacking the mainland or the mainland from attacking them. So we've perpetuated a division of China with force. And we have actually worked out between 1971 and 1979, a way of kicking this issue down the road and depriving Beijing of any incentive to regard it with urgency or to act prematurely to continue the civil war with force. We made 3 assurances to Beijing. One was we will have no official relationship with Taipei, but we now have a $230 million building in Taipei that flies the American flag and has Marine Guards in it. And it's very hard not to consider that an embassy. Our officials go to Taipei and talk officially with Taiwan officials. Taiwan officials come to Washington. We have basically invalidated that. Second, we said we would have no troops on the island, but now we do. Again, supposedly for training purposes, but they're also, in effect, a tripwire for a war with China. And third, we said we would not have a defense commitment to Taiwan. But the late former president, Joe Biden, on at least 4 occasions, asserted a defense commitment, which is at odds with both the Constitution, which reserves that right to the Congress. Congress is in default, but there's also a law called the Taiwan Relations Act that basically restricts our relationship to Taiwan in the military area to arms sales. We have an agreement with the Chinese on that too, which was to reduce those arms sales. We've instead increased them. So we are in violation of the modus vivendi we worked out. And I think it's remarkable under the circumstances that the Chinese have shown the restraint and patience that they have. They are intent on requiring the ability to take Taiwan by force over American opposition. They have apparently set a deadline of 2027 for that. And that is because that is an anniversary of the establishment of the People's Liberation Army. They have also set a deadline now, 2029, to achieve essential independence from supply chains that connect them to the United States. So in the meantime, Mr. Trump, our president, basically fired our wad at China. The one convincing deterrent that we really had with the Chinese, short of the use of force, was sanctions, tariffs, the like. We just did that. And the Chinese faced us down and showed that they could survive. And not only survive, but they could take advantage of this to achieve the objective they've set for 2029. That is an end to over dependence on the American market and American supply chains, whether for grain or high technology.
Thanks for watching. This video is a product of Current Affairs magazine, the country's leading independent left print magazine based here in New Orleans, Louisiana. Go to currentaffairs.org to find out more about us, and currentaffairs.org/subscribe to subscribe to our absolutely gorgeous bi-monthly print edition. Get it in your mailbox. You can also subscribe to the Current Affairs News Briefing, the Current Affairs podcast, or you can subscribe to our digital edition. Current Affairs is entirely reader-supported. We have no ads. We have no corporate backers. We depend on you. So please consider purchasing a subscription or making a donation to Current Affairs today. We are a 501c3 non-profit organization, and your donations are tax-deductible to the extent allowable by law. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.